Today, my updated table of contents is sort of to continue with a discussion of the view, the Madhyamaka view, the Prasangika Madhyamaka view as explained by Tsongkhapa, focusing on the idea that, the middle way view is emptiness and the equivalency of emptiness and dependent arising, in the sense that they cash out as having the same meaning. And if you think that emptiness cashes out as something other than making dependent arising possible, then you haven't properly understood emptiness. So, but then in particular, how Tsongkhapa understands emptiness is not just dependent arising in terms of causes and effects, or dependent arising in terms of wholes and parts, but dependent arising in terms of the relationship between minds and the objects of mind in particular. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about that because that's kind of like it's the most difficult thing probably. Let's say, of the important things, it's the most difficult one, right? There are other really difficult things, but they might not be quite as central to the whole project as that is. And then by request, I'll try to append to that some discussion about how, in the context of this radical sort of Chandrakirtian derived understanding of Nagarjuna's idea of emptiness, Tsongkhapa is nonetheless able to understand the working of karma. And I'll just talk about what he, in particular, says about that. That's quite distinctive and has been subject to some criticism by subsequent people outside the Gelukpa order, and maybe more interestingly, doesn't really get talked about very much within the Gelukpa order. But I think it's very interesting to me. I get some sort of spiritual meaning out of it myself, but maybe it's not helpful for everybody. But anyway, that's a request. And then later today, at some point, we'll get to talking about the two truths. So that was what my original doctoral dissertation at the University of Virginia was. The first half of it was published as a book called The Two Truths. So that's what I've studied when I first went to India in some depth. What is conventional truth? What is ultimate truth? How do they relate to each other in Tsongkhapa's philosophy? And then finally, to talk about hermeneutic. I was like, does people know what hermeneutic means? Like, hermeneutic means how do you interpret things? Okay, so in general, usually the word means, so it's derived from Hermes, the messenger, which is Mercury, right? The messenger god. So how do we get the message how do we get or receive a message from the text? So it's a fancy way of saying, a philosophy of interpretation. And it can mean, in general, how do we interpret the world that we see around us, or it can mean more specifically and more typically, it means how do we interpret a text a scriptural text that we find in front of us. So, in a Christian context, this is how do we read the Bible, right? The Bible says lots of different things, different books written by different people at different times for different purposes. But if you are, as a Christian taking it, this is all the Word of God, you have a challenge of explaining why God says this in this book and this other apparently different thing in the other book, right? And that's hermeneutics, right? So this is an important topic within Buddhism as well. So we'll end by talking about Tsongkhapa's approach to that. So that's my table of contents for today. So, emptiness and dependent arising. I was saying that, Nagarjuna says in the 18th verse of the 24th chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, the fundamental verses on the middle way, that emptiness and dependent arising have the same meaning. And then he says, and this is dependent imputation, and this is the middle way. Okay, so the middle way is this emptiness, dependent arising as equivalent, and by dependent arising, at least, as I would interpret that verse, he's saying what we really mean by dependent arising is dependent imputation. Now, in a lot of the book, he talks about dependent arising in terms of the dependence of effects on causes and conditions. And that's like really the primary meaning that you find throughout Buddhism, that, the Buddha taught independence on this, that arises. So it's very, that's how it reads, dependence on this, that will arise, that this has arisen in dependence on that. So if we put it in modern language, it would be like, for any X, it has arisen in dependence upon Y. There is no X such that X is just self-existent in and of itself. It's in some way dependent on Y. Now, then the question arises, what's the relationship between X and Y? and then you have the question is like, well, is the cause the same as the effect, or is the cause different from the effect? Is the cause other than the effect? And you would think that that would be pretty straightforward, because one's called X and one's called Y. They must be other than one another. But when we think that the cause has one nature and the effect has a different nature, right? Then it's like you get the problem of, well, anything could cause anything, insofar as these things are other than one another. So, right. And then if you start thinking about particular examples, like my speaking right at this instant, the immediate preceding cause, the primary substantial cause of my speaking right at this minute, whenever you're hearing me, is the prior moment of me doing the same thing. Like one instant before. Do you see what I'm saying? Right. That's the substantive cause of any particular moment you hear me, is the immediately preceding moment of mine doing that same sort of action, right? And do we really want to say that that's other? Right? And that's the main cause. It's like just the flowing downstream of the rivers. And it's like, and this isn't just this problem of saying like, well, whether the cause is really the same or different from the effect, or whether it's, other than the effect, isn't something that Nagarjuna made up and, Tsongkhapa went off on. It's in the Pali Canon. It's in, the first turning of the wheel teachings of the Buddha. This problem is raised, so there's example like in the Pali Canon of leaving milk out overnight, or I don't know if they say milk or yogurt. So you leave some milk out overnight, and you go back and you find the glass of milk on the counter in the morning, and is it the same as it was the night before or different? Right. And if you say, well, somebody snuck in the night and put a different glass in there. No, I mean, it's like the same glass, but then it's not the same glass because the milk has changed a little bit. Well, when did it change? Did it change at midnight? No, it was changing every freaking microsecond. Right. And so then you're just like, well, it gets really, and people's like, let's not think about this anymore. This is making me uncomfortable. Yes, and that's what you have to dig into, because that way we get uncomfortable is like that discomfort comes from our not wanting to look at this discordance between how we always think about and perceive and implicitly assume the world to be, right, and how things actually flow, right? They flow from one instant to another in a way that defies the ability to be categorized as being the same nature or a different nature. That's what it means to say that dependent arising works only because of emptiness, right? If things weren't empty, then they would have some fixed nature. They would have some essential nature. Is that essential nature going to be the same as the preceding microsecond in the same continuum, or different from the same the preceding microsecond in the same continuum. So they just can't have some fixed nature, right? That's what makes the world work, and that's what, Nagarjuna throws back at us. The person who, the Buddhist who's offended by the idea of emptiness because it destroys the Four Noble Truths, he said, well, this is the only way we can have the Four Noble Truths, right? Is by understanding that things are empty. Okay, so dependent arising is emptiness. Emptiness is dependent arising. Means that they, in a sense, it's like, because Wittgenstein uses this phrase, they cash out. They cash out as having the same meaning. They have fundamentally they point at the same thing from different directions, right? Dependent arising is pointing at the idea that things exist in dependence on other things. And emptiness is pointing at the fact that things lack the ability to exist without depending on other things. So, right, they're converse ways of saying the same thing. They approach that same meaning or that same point from different points of view, different sides. Yesterday I was talking about how sometimes talking about emptiness, then people become fixated on this other mysterious thing called emptiness that they don't understand, and they reify emptiness as something other than their life and their world that they have to try to understand, but is always sort of mysterious and elusive. And whereas actually it's a way of talking about how all of this stuff is all the time. In his book, Emptiness Yoga, Jeffrey says, well, people think emptiness will take you away from the world and you'll be over here like looking into, and he said, no, he said, it takes, if you understand what this is, it's like takes you more deeply into things. And actually Chandrakirti, I think, has a line where he says, a person who comes to understanding emptiness will be more conscientious, diligent, more fully engaged. Maybe we could say it's pakyur in Tibetan, more fully engaged with the world, because then to understand it, you have to be paying attention to how these things work and thinking about it, right? Instead of just saying, oh yeah, of course, acorn is different from an oak tree, or is it? Then you don't think about it too much. Yeah. Kim?
I'd like to just make a comment. I'd like to just make a comment. I'm a scientist by training, and in terms of dependent arising, there's a course in mathematics. It's called functional analysis, where you don't talk about x is a function of y or y is a function of a number of x's, but you're talking about f as a function of multitude functions. So everything in life, you could look at it as a function of a number of variables in which the variables are not independent, but they're actually functions of other things. And then it just goes on and on and on forever. It's an upper level mathematics course on calculus. It's called functional calculus at one of the university that I took it. But science has interpreted life in such a way, and they model life in mathematical terms in such a way as well. So there's a lot of concordance between Buddhism and science. So I just want to throw it out there in case someone might be interested and take a look at the functional analysis book.
Yeah, there's probably.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. You could probably write something on comparing dependent arising and functional calculus, and there's Min, I think, wants the microphone.
I think I actually took one of this class.
You
took? Yeah, and it's actually, in some sense, that the scientists were saying that, well, all of this are too complicated, and we are just going to do approximation. We are going to make this assumption here, and it's going to be truth, and it's going to be self-evident.
Yeah, because Otherwise, you get stuck in an infinite regress of analysis, I guess, is that the point? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just sometimes it's just too complicated. You cannot do anything meaningful because you just keep on analyzing, and there's no amount of
Are you saying there's
computation.
no foundation or absolute ground of reality? Yeah. Yeah.
Just a quick addition, and thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. The way I try to look at my actions, I think there's another way to look at function. It's in terms of what function an action serves. And an action can serve more than one function. But if you always, if you're going to do something, or if other people are doing something, a good way to inquire is to ask the function of that action. And that brings us back to intent and the altruistic motivation.
Thanks.
Think.
Thank you. I don't know. My experience has been that the function of actions and the intention behind them can be really different. But anyway, so dependent arising, we usually talk about it. There's lots of ways that things are dependent and not related to one another. But usually talk about it in terms of effects depending on causes, which I said is the pan-Buddhist understanding, that wholes depend on parts, and that finally, in the subtle meaning, everything depends upon a mind designating it, or a mind from whose point of view it's suitable to be designated as X or Y. So in terms of wholes depending on parts, I mean, this is sort of implied in the Chittamatra scholars, or Mahayana scholars, did this thorough critique of Buddhist atomism, right? And so the idea, if anything has any kind of extension, if anything extends, either in space or in time, right, that it has to have parts. Right? Even if we aren't actually physically capable of breaking it into those parts, we can conceptually understand that if it reaches from here to here, there's this part of it, and this part of it, and this part of it, and this part of it, right? And so then you think, well, if things take up space, there must be something that they're built out of, that helps them reach across there. But when you look for that smallest possible instant of time or smallest possible particle, you get stuck with the problem that either that smallest possible instant or smallest possible particle has no extension whatsoever, in which case you're multiplying zero by an infinity and you still don't have any extension. Or it has a very, 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 very tiny extension in which we can't, put our electron microscope or laser, into breaking it. But still, it does have some extension such that there's an east side and a west side, or a top and a bottom, or something like that we can understand have to be there conceptually in order for it to have extension. And therefore, you don't really have any logical way to talk about partless particles out of which things that take up space or time, extend in space or time, are built, right? So this leads to the idea that that wholes, it's not like in some schools of Buddhist philosophy that wholes are just like made up, imaginary constructs, but there is something else real, and that's these little tiny bits or elements or something that it's made out of. Do you see what I'm saying? Because the little tiny bits are always made out of other little tiny bits and so forth, right? All the way down. So that you end up with the idea that, it's not like wholes is just a story. We tell battleships are a story we tell ourselves about a lot of iron molecules. Right? It's not, that doesn't work. Like, the iron molecules are real, but the battleship is just something we make up in our mind. Of course, the one that people are really talking about is the person, right? And so sometimes when you read Theravada texts, it seems like the story is that we have this illusion that there's a person or a self that's here and that we're very attached to it, and that's a lot of our problems. But when we search for the person, we can't find it. But what we do find instead is some muscle, some feeling of heat, some marrow, some bile, and so forth. So you find all these physical and mental parts through introspective observation, right, and analysis, which is called mindfulness, right? As referring to my talk yesterday, and it's like you find a whole bunch of stuff, but what you don't find is like the person. So the person's like a story, or an imputation that you've ascribed to some other stuff that is actually there. Right. So in that way of understanding, there's there's this false construction or imputation, but there's something else real that underlies it, that's behind it. Right. So this, Mahayana philosophy criticizes that idea and says, well, if you think there's something more fundamental that's real, you haven't really understand what no self means. It doesn't just mean that there isn't any concretely or substantially established person. It means that there isn't any substantially established bone tissue. There isn't any substantially existent feeling, right? This feeling refers to, a moment of mental consciousness, and that is has a duration or it doesn't, and you have the same problems. So, okay, so one of the things is that they're sort of getting at this idea that there isn't anything, whether you look at it in terms of parts or wholes, or causes and effects, there isn't anything that you can get back to in time or down to in terms of smallness in space. That's sort of the fundamental source from which things come. And then Tsongkhapa talks about how that isn't the subtlest meaning of dependent arising, because he thinks that people are not trapped in beginningless cyclic existence because someone taught them to believe in an eternal soul. That's an artificial construct or idea, and that people are inclined to go along with ideas like this because underlying it they have this subtle conception, subtle ignorance that reifies things as having an objective status of their own, such that they can exist independent of a mind from whose point of view it's appropriate to see them that way. So this dependence of objects on the mind is what he takes to be the subtle meaning of dependent arising, and therefore the subtle meaning of emptiness, that we have to realize. And this is, of course, the most difficult thing, and we were talking about it yesterday. It occurred to me, because of one of the questions or comments that we had yesterday, to think about well, right, it's not just that external objects are dependent on mind, but it's all internal objects are dependent on mind too. So when we say a feeling, when we say, oh, I have a feeling, or when we say I have a thought, I'm referring to this comment, that a thought is also conceptually designated from the point of view of a consciousness as well, right? So even when we introspectively reflect on what is going on in my mind, that's our mind is designating these as certain thoughts or certain feelings. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's we usually don't think about it in terms of all of our examples are in terms of external objects. But yeah, a good point was made yesterday that it applies to this internal objects that we observe when we try to tell a story about what we're observing within our own minds. All of that is also designated from the point of view of a consciousness. So this idea that things are imputed by conceptual thought or designated, labeled, ascribed, or imputed, and that everything is that way, not just big gross things, that everything is that way. It's the scriptural basis for it is in the Upali Sutra. I just was looking at that this morning, and it's I can't quote it exactly, but it's something to the effect of all these beautiful flowers that we see around us and all these golden houses exist without any inherent existence of their own, but are only imputed by thought. So that's the sutra that I've closely paraphrased a verse from the sutra. So it's not, this idea that things exist as conceptual designations has a sutra basis. And in Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, you see it come up in 2418 that I've been referring to, where he says, emptiness is dependent arising, which means dependent imputation. But in his 60 stanzas on reasoning, Yukti Shastika, he also says very explicitly, because things lack an inherent existence, they exist as mere imputations by thought, using essentially the same phrase that's in the Upali Sutra. So I just wanted to say that because we talk a lot of time about things as being imputations by thought, but I just want to say this has a basis. This specific phrase, of talking about how things exist, it has a basis in sutra and shastra texts from India. It's not something made up in Tibet. So this is what we need to talk about then and think about it. When we're thinking about dependent arising, Lama Yeshe, Introduction to Tantra, talks about looking at a building and thinking about, what are all the cause and conditions that had to come about for that building to be there, and don't just take it as it superficially appears as just set up there waiting for you to come and see it, right? But think about everything that had to take place in order to be there, right? Okay, that's one level of dependent arising. But then, we can, as I was trying to talk about yesterday, when we look around at things, we can, try to do that same practice in terms of subtle meaning of dependent arising with regard to each and everything we apprehend. And I guess that's unrealistic to do everything, but to pick some things out that advert, our minds advert to, there's a car, there's a beautiful watch, there's a person I find unappealing or appealing, right? And there's so your mind adverts to something. And then instead of just going into, Machiavellian machinations about how you'll get away from it or get closer to it, whichever it is that you want, you can think about, okay, what's the basis of imputation and what's the object imputed? Right. And you can do just instead of just thinking about what are the cause and conditions for this to appear, you can think about, well, yeah, a really important condition for this to appear is it being designated as such, right? So how does it get designated such? Well, it's when I see a certain shape, it's pretty much certain shapes, certain combinations of shapes, like the letter A. I go, watch. But then, as we were talking about yesterday, I don't acknowledge that I'm designating or imputing this or ascribing this or labeling this as watch. I, take it as though this watch is naturally appearing, as that it objectively existed as a watch with its own watchness and, watchiness. Yeah, watchosity coming, just radiating from the side. Right. And which is losing track of what's actually going on. Is that you're ascribing or identifying it as in a certain way. And then it's important to understand that in all of this, I'm not talking about when you designate something as a table or a chair or a watch or a person, it's not that you're doing anything wrong. That's the way everything exists. That's the only way that anything can exist, except as mere conceptual imputations. Yes.
I have a question about the negation of the object. As I struggled with this for many years, and a few years ago I started negating I would look at an object and negate it. So I went through this process, but it's still, I'm discovering as I work with it more, it's not the same. There's negating an individual object, but there's also negating of anything that appears, because it is interdependent, because everything's interdependent. So I wonder if you could say something about more, aside from the analytical part of negating each object, but when one starts to actually negate everything to realize the emptiness of the holistic negation of everything as not as a partless particle, but as a something or other.
Well, the first thing that occurs to me to say about that is that it might feel like you have to do that because you can do some sort of negation in the sense of deconstructive analysis of your falsely objectifying sense of a particular thing. And then when you look at something else, that thing, you're sort of back to square one. I think that's what you're talking about. Right. And so, all right. But it's not like you have to go through every object in the universe and do this analysis on every object. It's like said over and over again that if you take, if you analyze one particular object so thoroughly that you actually realize its emptiness, then you'll be able to understand those reasons, that insight, as applying to other things as well. That's what they say, and because they're not different in type, right? So if your reasoning gets to penetrating emptiness, knowing one means knowing all. That's what it said anyway in the text, right?
The question was related to. I can talk loud. No. Okay. The question, yes, thank you, and I agree. The question was related to. Is the perceptual field in itself the entire perceptual field, like an infant would perceive when it's first, born before it's named things? That in itself is an object.
Oh, I see.
And people do cling to that, I think, and that is what creates a subtle obstruction, even though they may be negating particular objects. That's what I'm trying to work with right now. So that, but
I see what you're saying.
I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. I feel like I think I understand your question now, and I don't really have anything to say about it except what I already said. If you're reifying the entire perceptual field separately from reifying any particular object within it, then you have to consider that as another instance of an object, which is also empty, and try to extend any realization of emptiness you have with regard to a particular base to the perceptual field as an object. Yeah. So anyway, that's what I was trying to say is like, so we, in FPMT, there's like the usual language is labeled. And so I guess you say labeled and object labeled. Do you say that? Yeah. The thing that's labeled and the label. So, let's take, if we say, the cup. So we have cup, and then we have this, shapes as they appear, within as a subset of our visual field, as you're saying. We have these particular sets of shapes. Now, which is the label and which is the object label? Presumably, cup is the label, and then the thing that's labeled is this appearance of these particular shapes. But which one is the cup? Cups exist, right? The right answer is what is called the label. That is the cup. The cup is the label. It's not like there are some cups that are out there as cups, and then we decide whether it's good to label them. You know what I'm saying? It's like, so we have labels on most of the cupboards in the kitchen here. And it's not like one of them is like, naturally the plate cupboard, and then of course it gets labeled as the plate cupboard because that's what it is. No, it's the plate cupboard because someone stuck a label on it that said the plate cupboard. So the plate cupboard, the designation of something, is the object. What you call the label. The label refers to the object, like cups. So when you say which is the cup, this shape, or the cup. The cup, the label is the object. I don't know that this is. I'm slightly saying why I have a little bit of a problem with that particular set of vocabulary, because it makes it sound like there's an object and then there's a name we put on it, but that's misleading. There's a basis of imputation, and then there's the object imputed. The object imputed is what you're calling the label. The object imputed is the cup. That's what a cup is. It's an imputed object. It's not a name that we put on top of an imputed object. That is the imputed object. Do you see what I'm saying? It's really, yeah. So that's why I want to say, I mean, I know it's not the vocabulary we're used to, but it's like I want to say basis of imputation and object imputed instead of label and basis of labeling or whatever. So object imputed, there's objects that are imputed as curtains. You know, we impute those as curtains because of certain set of cultural conventions and because our senses, you know, are set up on the basis of human karma and so forth. But then there's like these little tiny carpenter ants, which I saw one last night, and if they looked there and they said curtain in their mind, then they would be like really crazy. You know, they would be defective as ants. Do you see what I'm saying? They wouldn't have a proper set of ant faculties. Do you see what I'm saying? Or maybe they were, you know, clairvoyant ants that could read our minds and see that from our point of view, it was appropriate to designate those as curtains, right? So that's what I'm saying is like, and whenever something appears in your visual field, instead of just thinking, what are the cause and conditions for this? You can say, what is the basis upon which I am identifying or ascribing or imputing, you know, doorway there and clock there and Tonka there and lamp up here. It's like I go lamp, you know, and I'm, you know, and then make yourself aware of the process by which you're ascribing or imputing these things. And not to try to refute it or back away from it, but to understand that that's what it is. That's what it is to be a lamp, is like to be, you know, something designated from our point of view as that. Yeah. Did I lose you? No. Okay, good. All right. So I think that this is practical or useful from the point of view of maybe something like the example of what Mim was talking about yesterday with people calling him a nerd. You know, like when we think about rigidity, objectification, stereotyping, in the way we look at people around us in the world. That's what you were talking about. And you were trying to, you know, deconstruct the nerd imputation, right? And so if you realize it's like, well, things are conceptually designated as this or that, right? And they don't have any objective status, you know, that makes them permanently or naturally or essentially this or that. It can be appropriate to use certain labels and designations, right? And that's all that things are, is, you know, appropriate basis for like they're being designated as this or that. But it's not like there's some essential nature within the object that justifies this or that designation, and that allows us some kind of flexibility or understanding of different ways of seeing things, or I don't know, being outside the box or creative or more fluid in the way we look at the world. Yeah. So, Kim.
Thank you for me to ask this question. Yesterday, you know, we talked a little or on the site regarding what the basis of imputation and object of imputation that you've just talked about mainly are the perceptions, so objects from outside that we're looking at. And the trouble that I've always had is the idea of the Buddha nature being emptiness. And
Correct.
In that case, you know, when we talked a little yesterday in terms of emanation, how do you go from one emanation to another emanation? And I always felt that there is like something in the background making that decision so that you could go from one emanation versus another emanation from the Buddha nature. And you said that it's free will. So I would like to, if you could comment on how that free will relatively, fit in with the basis of imputation and object of imputation. I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot yesterday, and I thought that maybe in one emanation, that emanation contained in itself the free will, so that that emanation could decide what is the next emanation. I mean, that's all I could come up with, but I would love to hear some comments on that. That's like my biggest problem with the Buddha nature being empty.
Right. You
Thank
brought
you.
up that problem to me between sessions yesterday about the Buddha nature being emptiness. So start with explaining that in this system so in the third turning of the wheel scriptures, especially in certain, subset of them called the Tathagata sutras, there's an idea that there's a sort of Buddha essence or Buddha nature that's fundamental to sort of like a vast treasure buried in our basement that we don't know about. And the process of awakening is a realization or uncovering of that innate perfection that we all have, right? And that's been super important. It's like you can't. I mean, this is like a really important medicine in Buddha's Dharma pharmacy, right? It's not like a trivial part of just some obscure part or wrong part of Tibetan Buddhism. It's like, so many, you can't really understand Dogen or like half of Chan unless you have an understanding of the importance of the sutras in the third turning of the wheel that teach this idea. In this particular system, the second turning of the wheel scriptures are taken as definitive. And these are the perfection of wisdom texts primarily, which teach emptiness as the final nature of things and a finer nature of all things. And so there isn't like some sense in which there can be some Buddha nature that's, if you want Buddha nature to be the ultimate, it has to be emptiness. And so how can it be emptiness? It's our Buddha nature is our potential to become Buddhas insofar as our minds are completely empty of any fixed nature that separates them from being Buddhas right now. There isn't any, essence in me which blocks me from being a Buddha. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's the way we would talk about, like in the second turning of the wheel, we talk about Buddha nature as the emptiness of my mind right now, which means that there's no essential difference between me and a Buddha right now. Do you see what I'm saying? And rather than talk about some other non-empty positive thing that's in the basement of my soul. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. The problem of free will, I don't think we should really get into, because this is like outside of the Buddhist tradition to talk about that. I was just trying to interpret what I thought you were saying. It's better when you think about Buddhist philosophy to just think about the important thing is that we make choices. We have volition. We have choice. We decide to do this or to do that. This is conventionally true and really, really important. And it's not, in Tsongkhapa's way, discredited or canceled out by any understanding of emptiness. However, when you try to establish what is the person or agent that is the real possessor of free will, you end up talking about, it seems like, a kind of essentially real person, right, that is deconstructed under analysis. So just say, we're human beings and we have free choice. We can decide to do this or decide to do that. You don't have to think about it as an essential possession of some private property called free will. Yeah. Anyway, that's the way I think about those things. Okay, so I was about to say that we're talking about imputation, that in the lower tenet systems, there's this idea that the person we have this false construction of a substantially existent person, and by being attached to it, we're led into needless misery. But there is something real underlying that person, and then classically that's the aggregate, the mind and aggregates of the mind and body. Okay, so there's what's real, that aggregates the mind and body, and then there's what's delusory, and that's the person. Do you see what I'm saying? We project this person as a story that we're telling about the mind and body. Okay, and so that's not the way it is in this system, because the aggregates only exist conventionally because, everything can be broken down further, either in time or space, into smaller and smaller parts, and everything exists only from a certain point of view. So that's true of the aggregates, and that's true of the person as well. And so instead of having like a hierarchy of real things, this is an important point. Instead of like, here are the more real things and here are the less real things, right? Everything that exists only conventionally, right? Okay, so that means that there's a conventionally existent person just as much, no less than a conventionally existent bone or a conventionally existent hydrogen atom. These things are all conventionally existent and only conventionally existent, right? So instead of saying that the person is falsely ascribed or is the person, we impute the person in relationship to the aggregates, what Chandrakirti says, and how Tsongkhapa then explains this, is that there is a conventionally existent person which we usually call the mere I. When I say, I can decide whether to go to the store or not. And I'm not thinking about how does that I exist? And, I have no particular great greed to go to the store or not. It's not tangled up with a big net of afflictions. It's just, I'm just merely, I will be reborn. I will try to understand. If there's a person to whom that I refers that is merely conventionally existent. And that person is appropriately designated if that person is imputedly existent. What is it imputed in relationship? It's imputed in relationship to the collection of the aggregates. So the person is not any less real than the aggregates. They're both conventionally designated. The person's conventionally designated in relation to aggregates. That's not the problem. The problem is that we take this mere I, or conventionally imputed person, and we superimpose upon it the idea that it's not conventionally designated, but that it has, an innate quality of being able to possess bones and possess, I have my thoughts and you have yours, and right? I have my objects and you have yours, and there's this sort of reification or superimposition of this conventionally existent person as being really real. I talked about yesterday how, there's these two words for slathering stuff on top of what's there. Superimpose and impute are the ones I'm using. The imputing is good, and that's how stuff exists. The superimposing is like pretending that you're not imputing. Superimposing an objective ability to exist without having been imputed. And if you don't distinguish between these two, you get confused between what it means to say that an object exists and why we're trapped in cyclic existence. The superimposition is the exaggerated status. The imputation is recognizing that that's how things exist. They exist from certain perspectives, right? Okay. So this is something that took me a while to figure out, because I was so used to, from studying Buddhism, that thinking, the person's designated in relation to the aggregates. Well, the merely conventionally existent person is designated in relation to aggregates. But the ignorance that is the root of cyclic existence is not that mind which designates the person in relationship to the aggregates. It's a mind that takes that person who has been designated appropriately and regards it as not having been designated. Do you see what I'm saying? It's that takes a little while to get that sorted out. But I think it's important, because otherwise you don't understand. It's like, well, are Buddhists telling me a story about how I don't really exist? It always sounds like that. I'm glad that, some people have got that, so that's good. I taught a class on Buddhism at one time at the end of the semester in a big auditorium, and I wasn't really connecting with the students super well that semester. There's too many of them, and was like a bad room, and I did my regular shtick, but it just wasn't like reaching the back of the room very well. And at the end of the semester, I just said openly, like, what did you get out of this? And one person, raised his hand and said, well, I learned that a Buddhist is somebody who doesn't know who he is, but is sure that he used to be someone else. And I was like, wow, I was like, on one level, I think you really have something there. But in his mind, in his way of understanding this was a refutation of Buddhism. Do you see what I'm saying? He's saying, this is why it's so stupid what you're saying. That's what he thought, right? Right. So, yeah, I mean, we have to understand that we're not saying, it's like there aren't people here, but somehow these non-people are able to go along from life to life. That's not actually the system. There are persons, there are humans and there are non-human persons, and these persons are designated and exist imputedly. They're ascribed to collections of mind and body, right? And it's because they don't have a fixed nature that they flow along constantly, constantly changing, right? But then there's this continuum that flows along, and we designate the person in relationship to this sort of continuing of this collection over moments of time and collection of mental and physical parts. So I guess I'm going to try to make one last point, and then we're going to have a scone break. Which will be short, right? Because, yeah. Yeah. So all the other schools of tenets, all the other brands of Buddhist philosophy that, are recognized in this tradition as, being a hierarchy of tenets, say, yeah, the person, when a person is imputed and the person is, appropriately imputed, for the person to be appropriately imputed, you can't impute a person in relationship to this table. For the person to be appropriately imputed, there has to be something on the side of the basis of imputation that is that person. Do you see what I'm saying? There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but among that, so there has to be something there that makes it that. That is that. Right. And so and this is true of all the non-Chandrakirti based, even in the other Madhyamaka forms, right? There's something there that is the person conventionally, right, on the side of the basis of imputation. And this is sort of one way of talking about what's radical about the Prasangika view, is that there isn't anything in or among the basis of imputation that is the object imputed at all. So, for example, in the Bhava Viveka's system, let's say Sautranika, Svatantrika, Madhyamaka, the person is merely conventionally designated in relationship to the collection of mind and body. But this is an appropriate designation because conventionally, and he's not going to say ultimately, because ultimately he's going to say everything's empty, but conventionally, the mental continuum is the person. And that's why it's appropriate to designate the person. The mental continuum is what functions as the person, right? And because the mental continuum is there, with the other aggregates, it's appropriate to make that designation. So in this way, because there is that continuum of mind among the aggregates, it becomes recognized as appropriate to make the designation. It's not like a crazy idea. Do you know what I'm saying? I was saying, when you think about these Svatantric ideas, you can see why they had so much appeal in India. And it's not wrong to find this useful. It's like the Dalai Lama said a lot of times that if you have to go as far in understanding as emptiness is compatible with maintaining confidence in dependent arising. And if you feel that like mixing your mind, with the Chandrakirti's understanding of emptiness is going to make you lose confidence that things exist or your choices matter, then maybe that's not the right medicine for you right now. There's a lot of other medicines in the Dharma pharmacy. And it's really true that, as I was mentioning yesterday, that the Chandrakirti's, there's only one commentator in India on Chandrakirti's works. And he Chittamatra and Svatantrika views were more popular for a long time, and Chandrakirti's started really catching on in the 11th century in Tibet, and lots of people grappled with trying to figure out what Chandrakirti meant and came to a variety of conclusions. And Tsongkhapa pretty much decided that all of them were wrong. And he totally trashes Jayananda, who's the Indian commentator on Chandrakirti. And then he, implicitly but more politely refutes all of the earlier Tibetan interpreters of Chandrakirti and shows how in different ways they've misunderstood what he had to say. So, it's a subtle view that is being articulated. And in this view, there isn't anything on the side of the basis of imputation that is the object imputed. The object imputed is a mere designation, and that's what a cup is the label. That's what I was trying to say. Do you see? It's not that there's a cup and then we label it cup. Cup is it's a mere designation. So in other schools, for example, in Chittamatra, then you have the mind basis of all, functions as that thing which is on the side.
But how about it's not the...
Oh, microphone. Yeah.
It's not that it's the, you said it's not the cup and then we label it cup. It's not the sense material. Oh, sorry. I'm very bad at this. It's not the the sense data there and then we label it cup.
Yeah, the basis of imputation is this is sense information that comes, and then from my point of view, but not the ants, it becomes appropriate to make designated as cup, and that's what it is to be a cup, is something that's appropriate, to be designated as that from my point of view. Yeah. So this does lead to it does lead to some complications and interesting, just like the Chittamatra view that nothing exists as a different entity from the mind leads to okay, how are you going to explain dreams? How are you going to explain the fact that we all see the same room, and do we all see the same room, and so forth? And how do you explain that, when there's lightning in the sky, we're all seeing it at the same time? And it's so you have all these things. What's going on with clairvoyance? You have all these things that Chittamatra has to explain. How are you going to account for this in terms of the idea that everything is of one nature with the mind? Right. And just like that, the Prasangika view that everything's a mere designation, from the point of view of a particular being, has some complications that go along with it, and that people have to sort of sort out and try to figure out how to answer. And that's why I was saying yesterday that Tsongkhapa says that it is when the more deeply your understanding of emptiness is, it can be harder to understand precisely how to posit it in a way that's consistent with dependent arising. Tsongkhapa says that. He says, so at least just hold on to those words and don't be pushed off of it. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said the same thing, that it's easy to say emptiness means dependent arising, but the deeper you get into it, you can see that it's hard. And that's, as I said, why Tsongkhapa, who is this super genius, did 3,500,000 prostrations and had to, use a medium to channel Manjushri and so forth to help him, penetrate this view, because it is subtle. So we'll have a scone break, and then I'll come back and talk. Designate scone in relation to what? Okay. Okay. All right. So the point I was trying to make is, since everything that exists as a mere conceptual imputation, there aren't hierarchies of realness among things that exist. It's flat in the sense. It's like the things exist, they exist merely conventionally, which means they exist as mere imputations. And there isn't like a sense in which parts are more fundamentally real than wholes, or that causes are more real than effects, or vice versa, or that the mind is more real than the objects it perceives, okay? And so there isn't any sort of hierarchy like that. In regard to another example is, sometimes you see people who say that agents, people doing things and objects of action are somehow superficial in relationship to processes. I don't know, it's like everything is process, man, right? You've heard that, right? It's all everything is process. So, if you have any idea or, story that you tell yourself about a person or an object, within that process, that's seen as like a reification or concretization relative to the more fundamental truth that it's all a process. Okay, so people are getting at something there, and it's trying to break down the sense of reification of sort of solid units that exist in and of themselves. But it's important to understand that from the point of view of this system, the process itself is also merely conventionally designated. There isn't anything that's like more fundamental than anything else. If it exists, whether it's called a process or whether it's called a person that's involved in the process, it's merely conventionally designated. And this is also true of the distinction between ultimate reality and conventional reality. And we'll talk more about this today, but I don't think necessarily right now. But this, is related to the point that I was making with Kim about Buddha nature, is that, there's ultimate truth and a conventional truth, and they both exist, and therefore they both exist only conventionally. And this is, kind of a distinctive contribution, a creative and distinctive contribution, insight that Tsongkhapa made to the tradition, I think. But I'll come back to that. For right now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, that minds are not, so you say everything exists as a conceptual imputation. Somebody could understand that to mean like that the world is like a projection from some mind back here that's real. Like there's a real mind that projects out some fake stuff or tells a story out there, but there has to be a real projector of the mind that's back in here. So that's Chittamatra like way of thinking, right? That the mind is more fundamental and real, and external objects are illusory. But that isn't what this system says. In Prasangika, as I said, if anything exists at all, it exists only conventionally. So minds exist only conventionally, and their objects exist only conventionally. Neither is more real than the other. So therefore, there are external objects. This is like, Chandrakirti refutes Chittamatra at length, and Tsongkhapa, follows through on that. And I mean, the idea about a mind basis of all that stores up the seeds of our past karma is like a really good story that's really useful. It's a part of the Dharma. It's part of the teachings of the Buddha in the third turning of the wheel, sutras. And so it's not to be treated with disrespect. It's just that it's not the view of this system, that's the final way that things are, okay? And in this explanation of how things actually are, following the second turning, their external objects are no more or less real than any part or aspect of the mind that exists. So that means that that atoms exist, that molecules exist, that tables exist. And so some people could think, well, Sounds like the world I already believed in. Right? But here's the thing. We usually think reflexively based on our, scientific, rudimentary scientific education, that the objects we see around us are made out of atomic particles, right? Are made out of, that they're established on the basis of being in their nature collections of particles. But if you think that like tables are made out of atoms, just reflexively the way I do, then you're not thinking in terms of the Prasangika view. You have to remind yourself that atoms are merely conceptually imputed, and the table is merely conceptually imputed, and that's the only way that anything exists. Of course, there are atoms that exist, on the side of the table. Because they're conceptually imputed. It's appropriate to conceptually impute there as being atoms. But if you think that the table's made out of atoms, then you haven't really understood what the point is of the view. And I think it's important to say that because Tsongkhapa's view kind of recovers the ordinary world or the conventional world for us, right? It says that there are tables, there are chairs, there are people. And I'm thinking, okay, what's the problem? Like, I already believed in all these things. You know what I'm saying? It's like, how does this harm my ordinary way of living or change it if you're just tell me that all of these things are just as real as emptiness itself, which is what it's saying. Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't. It's like, yeah, I believe in this stuff, and so does the Buddha. It's all equally real. So you have to take to mind this idea that it's not like in Tsongkhapa, this actually doesn't come from critics outside the tradition. It comes from, good teachers within the tradition saying, don't think about it as though that essential, I never heard of essential nature. I just believe in tables and chairs. So don't think of it as essential nature as this thing that's like added onto the top of what you already believe in. And then you hear about emptiness and you take it off again and you're back where you started, right? And this is a internal critique within Gelukpa of the downside, you could say, of this particular way of teaching. Yeah, we save the conventions of the world from being, downgraded into mere illusions relative to some other reality, right? But that's not supposed to leave us right back where we started. We're supposed to be left with this sense of, yeah, these conventional things exist, but not at all in the way that we ordinarily see them. So in other words, the tables and chairs and mountains and so forth exist, but we're not. And so there's a conventional correctness to our minds knowing those things. But the way we see them as existing is overlaid with these heavy layers of distortion. So we don't see them as mere imputations by thought. And it's so alien to us to think of them as, just being that relative to a certain point of view, that it's really hard to get our minds around that and, start to practice seeing things as that way, as being this or that relative to my point of view, rather than just being that objectively. And that's why I take the point of view that I do. One of the examples that's used in Chittamatra to talk about things in relationship to mind, and you probably heard the story about gods, ghosts, and humans come down to the river. And so gods, having god karma and so forth, when they come down to the river, they see like a river of nectar flowing along. And when we go down there, we see water because that's what it is objectively, right? And and when this hungry ghosts with their funky hungry ghost karma go down there, then they see a river of molten tin or something, So, right? Or it could be pus and blood, depending on their particular brand of hungry ghost that they are, Oh, well, okay, we'll work that out later. So, yeah. So, it just feels like for Chittamatra, this is an attempt to demonstrate that there aren't any external objects, but there's just like from the point of view of different minds, there appear to be different things there. And these things can't objectively exist out there, because if they did, there would be all these different things in the same place, right? That's sort of Chittamatra idea. And Prasangika takes us over and says, okay, well, what do we do with this when humans and ghosts go down to the river, right? And they're seeing these three different things, right? But there are external objects. There are external objects, right? So what is that external object? What is it on its own side, though? It's flowing relative to all three of those beings, but what if you're a water skeeter or a fish? It might not. Do you know what I'm saying? So this is Tsongkhapa's thing about, like, well, if we set aside how the rope snake looks to the person who thinks it's a snake and just ask what the snake's like in and of itself, we're not going to have anything to talk about. And that's what we get stuck with external objects. They're external objects, but when you try to talk about what the properties of those external objects are on their own side, independently of how they appear to certain types of being, there's nothing left to talk about. So they have properties, and external objects have properties and qualities and natures, but these are relative to the perspective of different kinds of beings. This is a Prasangika view. So, different Gelukpa, but one Gelukpa interpreter, I'll just not mention his name at the moment, but one Gelukpa, because I'm going to disagree with his view, but one particular Gelukpa interpreter argues that, well, when God goes, humans, hell beings, animals, and so forth, beings from the six realms, demigods, all go down to the river, then they all see something different flowing. It's because 1/6 of the external object is each of those things. Though that view is seriously maintained, and I think you could probably find some geishis who would defend it, because it is in the tradition.
1/6 of that's it. Could you tweak it?
1/6 of the external object is the appropriate basis for the imputation of each of those things, and each of the beings just tunes into that 1/6 of it that's appropriate to their karma to connect with. Yeah. So I don't think that that's right, Min. Do you have a question?
No, I think it kind of makes sense in some way.
You like the 1/6 approach? Okay.
Not honestly, no, not the 1/6 approach, but it kind of makes sense in a sense that if you're like God beings and you are attuned to, let's say, energies, right?
Right.
And so you go to the river, all you see is momentums and energy flowing from one potential to the other, and energies on energies. If you are human beings like me, I'm interested in
whether you can drink it or not.
What can I drink it or not? So I go down there and see drinkable water. If you are a hell beings or hungry ghosts, you go there and you see violence and suffering, all things eating each other's, and you see blood and things moving on along.
Right.
So is it 1/6 of the objects that?
I see. So when he explains it, it sounds more reasonable.
Well, no, you can. I was trying to do the same thing that he's pushing forward, and it's like say why a very reasonable, intelligent person could argue that. It has been put forth in the Gelukpa tradition seriously as an interpretation of what this means from a Prasangika point of view. I don't look at it like that. The way I look at it is that what this is intended to show is just exactly what Tsongkhapa was saying with the rope snake example. It's like that it isn't anything in particular. There are external objects, but you can't say anything about them, what their properties are, or what 1/6 of the properties are, except from taking into consideration the point of view of different beings. And from the point of view of us, it's 100% water. And from the point of view of the gods, it's 100% nectar. And then people say, well, how can it be like pus and blood, nectar and water at the same time? Well, that's because you think that these external objects have some fixed intrinsic nature. And this is like a way of thinking about how the Gelukpa version of the Prasangika view is still a Prasangika view, which is very different from the ordinary common sense point of view. It's a point of view that different things can be in the same place at the same time among these external objects, depending on who's looking. Like, for example, I was doing the thing yesterday with I'm at Sravasti Abbey and the turkeys are at Sravasti Abbey. But we're seeing, like, we're in another sense in completely different worlds. It was like, you could say, we're both there and there's certain external objects around us, but what those external objects are correctly perceived as is completely different. Yeah. So that's how I understand it. External objects doesn't mean, okay, now let's talk about what these external objects are, because they aren't anything in and of themselves. You have to talk about what are they for whom, okay? And now this goes to how I think, and then there's a whole bunch of different Geshe perspectives on this. But what you do with the story of the tree that falls in the forest when nobody's there to look at it, or what you do with the story of the Big Bang, and like how was this world working before there were humans around to impute this or that thing as existing? Do you see what I'm saying? And right. So how does that work? When we were talking yesterday about what happens first, the appearance or the imputation, we're talking about like the construction of a chair, this moment where we're all in the room with the chair. But what happens when nobody's watching? And so some people will say, well, there's always somebody watching because there's living beings everywhere, And yeah, but they're not living beings everywhere who take that to be a chair. And, sometimes it's just the carpenter ant walking around, one carpenter ant walking around this whole building, and it doesn't see any of the objects that we see, it's these different things. And then some people said, and I've heard Geshe say that it's like, this isn't a problem because there's always the Buddha who's all-knowing, who's designating each thing as what it is relative to the different beings. Yeah, okay, I'll just leave it at that. That's not what I would like as my answer. So what I think is that, this is what it means to say that there are external objects. There are external objects. When you say that, this is a cup insofar as it's imputed as a cup, like if I leave the room and we all leave, does it stop being a cup? It continues to be like suitable to be imputed as a cup. It's like one of my teachers. I think it was. It's in Anne Klein's book, Path to the Middle. Kensur Yeshe Tupten. He's like saying, well, it's like a pound of butter is doesn't stop being a pound of butter when you take it off the scale. So like relative to our point of view that, this is a cup, whether we're looking at it and designating it a cup at that particular moment or not, right? And so relative to our point of view, we designate based on data that we're collecting and then revising and refining, a story about how the world evolved, right? And so there doesn't have to be, in other words, there doesn't have to be a sentient being present at every single moment of everything that exists, designating it as this or that in order for there to be external objects. There are external objects, and these external objects function, but you can't say how exactly they function or what they do without taking into consideration certain beings, But it doesn't mean that the beings have to be watching at that time. And anyway, I don't know if that helps, but that's as far as I've gotten in figuring it out. And I think it took me a while to arrive at that because, yeah, but I think that's right. Okay. Last thing, I'll try to talk about before lunch is like, how does this understanding of emptiness relate to karma? And particularly there's this concept called disintegratedness. So the first time Tsongkhapa comes close to this topic is think in volume 1, that is when he's talking about karma in the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path. And, he's saying, karma moves on from life to life. And how does that work if there isn't any, permanent person who's like carrying it? And he quotes a text. Now I don't know if it's Buddhapalita. I sort of feel like it is, but he quotes an Indian Shastra, in which there's a story about a bird that's walking on the roof of a house, and then the bird, even though it's walking on the roof of the house, that you can see the tracks of the bird in the yogurt that's down in the kitchen underneath the roof. And I'm like, okay, what's that an example? How is that helping? And it's like, so, our geishas told us that this is not considered a paranormal event. This is just considered common sense, that of course people know that sometimes that happens. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that sometimes you get, bird footprints in your yogurt, and because the birds are walking on the roof up above. It's just something that happens. It doesn't happen in our cultural context, but in the cultural context of which this text was generated, it was just taken for granted that this is a good example of how karma works, because people already know the instance of, the bird's foot has never gone down into the yogurt, yet the imprint of its foot is there in the yogurt. And that's how it is with karma, going from one lifetime to the next. And that's where he leaves it. He just stops talking about it, because it's not really what he's talking about, avoiding non-virtue, and then he wants to get onto the topic of cultivating compassion. And so he doesn't go into well, what does that really mean with the bird and so forth, right? And later, I don't know, maybe when Jimma writes the biography, we'll see exactly how this comes about. But I think it's because, there are a lot of troubling questions, and you can imagine that this might have been one of them that came up about, well, okay, how does this really work? Because you've told us, and that in your tradition it's really important to use reason and analysis and not, go on folklore to understand how these things work, and that reason doesn't just reduce everything to emptiness and then faith. We can use reason to understand how things work at a conventional level and improve our understanding of how we treat other people, how we talk to other people, how we put, matter together to make different kinds of objects. All of these things can be improved by using reason and our conventionally, our conventional senses at the pragmatic level. So why just tell the bird story and then leave it at that when you're trying to tell us something so important about how karma works? And so this is among the 8 difficult issues. So Tsongkhapa has a famous text called Gane Gye, which means 8 difficult points. And it's just organized to go through these 8 difficult points and talk about how the Prasangika view relates to each of these concepts. And one of these is the problem of, the mind basis of all. And if we don't have a mind basis of all, how does karma move on from lifetime to lifetime? And so he discusses this, quite a bit. And what he says is that in terms of the ability to serve a function, or in other words, to have an effect, there isn't any essential difference between something that's present, right in the moment, and something that's disintegrated in the prior moment. So there's this general idea, and those are that there used to be this idea, right, in Buddhist philosophy, that there's a moment when things arise, there's a moment when they're there, and then there's a moment when they're gone. There's these 3 moments, right? And then, in higher Buddhist philosophy, there's just all those things happen at the same time. That's just one moment, and things arise and disappear, rise and disappear, rise and disappear, rise and disappear all the time, right? So, when we're dealing, just like when we look at the stars, we're looking at something in the past. When we deal with each other, we're looking at, each other as we were, each of us was slightly before, right? And still, yeah, we usually manage to communicate, even though I'm talking to your past self, because it's not that far in the past, and you're talking to my past self, even though it's not that far in the past. But still, like, God, is like time travel, or how does that work? And so, Tsongkhapa is like, well, a disintegrated, something that has, it's not only the thing in the moment, when it arises and disappears, that single instant when it's present, that it has effectiveness, right? In the moment it disintegrates, there's the disintegratedness of that event, the having just happenedness of whatever. And that can have an effect. That's able to function. That's no more or less real than the thing itself, the instant before. That's what Tsongkhapa says. He calls it shikpa, which means disintegratedness. To disintegrate. So ba, just sort of nominalizes it. So it's like disintegratedness. So there's like each thing that happens in the moment right after it happens, there's the disintegratedness of that, which is the having happenedness of that. And that having happenedness is a functioning thing, which then disintegrates. And there's the disintegratedness. So there's a stream of disintegratednesses, of everything that's ever existed momentarily. Like, infinite numbers of photonic, particles being projected from every single instant of happening. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's just like, whoa, that is like so weird, right? But then, it's like, so does it make sense? It's like, I've thought about it a lot, and I feel like it does make sense to me. Because I feel like there's not so much an important distinction between, what exists and what doesn't exist between things that have happened and things that haven't happened. Because if you just say, well, what exists right in this instant versus what doesn't exist right in this instant, then there's no such thing as Thomas Jefferson. There's no such thing as Martin Luther King. There's no such thing as, Tsongkhapa Losang Chakpa. I mean, it's like, if they're not existing right now, it's just similar to talking about all the unicorns prancing around on Mars. And nobody really thinks that that's the same thing. What's really important is like whether something's happened or not. And the stuff we're talking about has always already happened before we can get to talk about it, right?
I'm sorry about that. I think it's scientifically been shown, or scientists are starting to look at, there's this tendency in nature, and I think Hermes talked about it too, that something, once it's happened, tends to happen again. Mm-hmm. It's a principle of nature. Uh-huh. So I just wanted to mention that. There's a tendency for repetition.
Mm. Yeah,
so that's an actual physical principle. Mm. So I think that may play into what he was saying. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to think of, we can think of examples of things that, just Indian cosmology, generally works in cycles of things happening over and over again, usually like a quadrillion years later or something like that, right? But it's like, there's this recurrence of the same patterns. Like there's Indra, but that's just the Indra of this universe in this world system of this particular time. And there's like, when the Buddhists come and talk about, there's some beings who think they created the world, People believe that someone created the world. Well, yeah, there are some beings who not only were there as the first beings in this universe, and being that they formed the idea that they had created the world, but there were other beings at the beginning of other worlds who thought they created those worlds, and so forth. So there is that kind of cyclic nature, recurrence of things is super important in Buddhist and all Indian cosmology. But I don't know if that's exactly the same thing. I don't think Tsongkhapa doesn't talk about that in the context of explaining this issue. He's more interested in, how can my choice at time X, affect something that happens like many years later or in a different lifetime? How does the impetus of that, how does the wave or ripple, get from here to there? And, so if we're not going to talk about a storehouse consciousness, and that, our actions are stored up as like seeds or potentialities that are residing in this storehouse consciousness as part of our mental continuum, then because he doesn't have that story, he's refuting that story, right? Actually, then how does it get downstream? And so Tsongkhapa in the Gane Gye is 8 difficult points. He talks about every Buddhist system has to answer this question. How does karma work in the context of whatever emptiness they kind of no self they believe in? And then he sort of briefly surveys some of the different answers that people have come up with, right? And then he says, what this is our way is the mere having happenedness is ineradicable. You can never unbe the person who ripped that dude off, man. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? That's all that having happenedness of some act that you did in the past is ineradicable, right? And so that's in a sense what all these disintegratedness point is talking about, is that there's a continuum of moments of that. I'm doing having happenedness for disintegratedness. There's a continuum of moments of having happened that just keeps flowing out from every act or choice, or really every event is the way I would look at it. Not just every act of. Not just every volitional act. I don't see Tsongkhapa is only interested in volitional acts and karma when he brings this up, but I don't see how you can distinguish it from volcanoes erupting and so forth like that. It's anything that happens, then it will always have happened going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the connection between habit and disintegratedness.
Yeah. Right.
Could you say something about that?
Well, I think if since once you do something, there's always associated with your continuum the condition of having been the person or being appropriately designated as the person who in the past did that. Then if you do that creates perhaps a sort of, on karmic terms, a predisposition towards doing that kind. One of the ways that karma has an effect is beginning to create a rut, or a tendency towards engaging in the same kind of action again. There's the first time you do it, and then there's all the other times, which are reenactments of the first time you did it. And if you do it more, it becomes, part of your personality or character, and instead of just being a person who happened to steal something, then you're, identified as a thief, and perhaps even begin to identify yourself as a really good thief, not just those ordinary thieves, right? And, and so then you incorporate, you identify with this kind of pattern of action as who your real self is, and, predisposes you to doing it a lot more. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say about disintegratedness. It's almost never talked about, and I stumbled across this. I never heard it from any of the geishas I studied with. I stumbled across it because I was translating the 8 difficult points, and I was like, "What the heck is this?" And then, it's like, well, this is what Tsongkhapa said about how karma works, But it could be that our teachers, skillfully and compassionately just, don't find it necessarily the most helpful thing to talk about. And instead, say, well, it's easier just to think about, karma works in terms of predispositions, and they're like these latencies that are left over from your past actions are like seeds. And, it's using the vocabulary of Chittamatra to talk about it, right? Which is what all the Mahayana Buddhists were pretty much doing in India, except for Chandrakirti, right? Who was systematically refuting that idea. Okay, I don't know who to call on. I saw Min and Kim at exactly the same time. Yeah.
Mine is very simple. Can you give us the title of the books where you did the translation for the 8 difficult things? And then if you could also recommend a book that could do the refutation of this Chittamatra from the
Prasangika point of view.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so my translation of the 8 Difficult Ones is not published yet. It's part of a bigger project which has been stalled for years. This text has been translated by other people and published. And the translations are not necessarily particularly accessible. It's one of those translations where a person takes a scholar translating for other scholars and wanting to be accurate, translates words from Tibetan into Sanskrit. Not all of the words, but a lot, too many or sometimes even leaves things in Tibetan. So people will know exactly what the text said, but then, it's not exactly a complete translation anymore. So, it's really good for what it is, but then it isn't something that anybody could easily read. If there's been a more readable translation of the 8 Difficult Points that's been published so far, I'm not aware of it. I think you're asking about books. It reminds me that I was sort of intending for those people who have, already been grappling with these topics a lot. Maybe a really good book that you haven't read is Tsongkhapa's Final Exposition of Wisdom. If you haven't looked at that, then that would be something to look at. Be Hopkins' translation of the insight section of the middle length exposition of the stages of the path, and then also some sections from the elucidation of the thought. So he focuses on the wisdom or insight sections of those 2 texts. Thurman had already translated, that section of medium exposition, and the Hopkins translation is also available of the same text. And I think there will be a forthcoming complete translation, maybe by Jimba, I'm not sure, of the elucidation of the thought. But for now, we have, a portion of it that's really well translated by Hopkins. And he has a lot of comments and footnotes and elaboration on it. And he compares it at length to Dolpapa Sherab Gyaltsen, who we were talking about yesterday, because he did this book after he did Mountain Doctrine, which is like a big book by Dolpapa. So he had, thoroughly embedded himself in Dolpapa's view, and then gone back to look at Tsongkhapa again. And so then at the end of the book, he compares and contrasts Tsongkhapa's view to Dolpapa's view in a like a bullet pointed comparison, right? Is very helpful, I think. And he boils it down. He say all of these 37 differences come down to these 5 main points, and all these 5 main points really come down to one fundamental difference between the 2 of them. And the fundamental difference is the idea of whether if a mind knows the ultimate reality, does that mean that ultimate reality ultimately exists? If there's a mind that knows the ultimate, then it would be normal, and many people have said, well, therefore that is what it means for something to ultimately exist, because it's known or found by the mind knowing the ultimate reality. And therefore, it's not true, as I've been saying, right? If you accept that view, it's not true that everything's just conventionally existent. Everything's conventionally existent except one thing, and that is what that thing which the ultimate mind knows. Do you see how that's not like a crazy thing to think? And you're just like, how does Tsongkhapa avoid saying that? He does avoid saying that, right? But how does he avoid saying that? And so, but you can see, like, if you say, okay, there's one thing that's ultimately real, and that's the thing that the ultimate mind knows, then all this other stuff is illusory, and deceptive in relationship to that one real thing. And what we should be focusing on is trying to know that one real thing, right? And that's how Dolpapa, through that kind of reasoning, ends up with a system that, although it uses all the words of Buddhism, is, a form of monism, and in that way not that different from Shankaracharya, Advaita Vedanta, because, like, ultimately there is reality, right, which goes beyond our ability to conceptualize or articulate, but it's just one of it. There's just one. And all the apparent diversity of the world is a product of delusion, and there aren't any distinct, actually existing, different objects, right? So I'll come back after the lunch break and talk about how do we understand or defend the point of view that even emptiness exists only conventionally, and then I'll, which is very important, and then we'll talk about how Tsongkhapa explains, especially in Elucidation of the Thought, which is, his last big book that he wrote in the year before he died, how he explains how conventional truth is related to ultimate truth based on commentary on Chandrakirti, where Chandrakirti is presenting the two truths. And then, as time allows, at the end of the afternoon, I'll come around to the issue of hermeneutics, right? How Tsongkhapa approaches texts and scriptures that I'm talking about Buddhist texts from India, right? How he reads them and relates them to one another in a way that's different from how other people had done before, and why I think that's really important and not an obscure thing. Okay, all right, thanks. Well, I guess some of us will go out to lunch together, and others can, go take a nap and recover. Yeah. At 2 we'll start again. Okay, thank you, everybody.